Teiss Talk, the live webinar with no presentations, no PowerPoint, just talk.
Hello. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning from wherever you are joining us. And welcome once again to Thursday's Teiss Talk. Today, we're talking all things ransomware. So we, of course, have got a very, very good set of panelists for you. And we are looking forward to your questions. Talking of questions, you will see up in the top right of your screen the Q&A tab. This is where you're going to be putting your questions. I see JJ Davey has already put his question there. This is if you put your question there and it gets asked and we like it, it makes me laugh, it's interesting, it's picked at random, who knows, you could be in the running for a Teiss Talk mug. Much coveted, apparently. People will collect anything these days. But yes, you could win a Teiss Talk mug. Welcome also to our guest from LinkedIn. I said it last week. It didn't happen, so I'll say it this week. If you ask us a question from LinkedIn, there's an extremely high likelihood you are going to win a mug. I'm just saying. Right, so without further ado, shall we get on with the show? Let me bring onto the stage our three panelists. We have got Shak, Lester, and Kailee. Please come onto the stage. Hello, Lester.
Hey, hello.
Seems to me you're coming from Toronto there. Is that right?
Yep, that's right. It's still winter here. No, I'm kidding. It's hot and sunny already.
Very good. And hello, Shak.
Hello. Hi. Nice to meet you, Tom.
Thank you, and you. And hello, Kailee.
Hi, Tom. Thanks for having me.
No problems. And you'd never guess that Kailee was sitting in a 1970s-inspired hotel room not 5 minutes ago. So we've obviously mastered the technology today. Folks, thank you for joining us. Let's jump straight into our news story. And that first news story is from InfoSecurity Magazine. Backup repositories targeted in 93% of ransomware attacks. Now, I'm not going to focus on that headline. I want to focus on the opening statement, which it said 85% of organizations have suffered from at least one ransomware attack over the last 12 months. 85%. Does that surprise anybody?
It's a huge number.
Yeah, it is huge. Sorry, go ahead, Shak.
No, I was going to say it is surprising in terms of like the number, but then there's a lot of cases, I guess, that that are put together. Certainly, if you look at it from a ransomware perspective, they report a lot of the data that they exfiltrate, so you kind of see it from the attacker's side as well. So it's a lucrative business.
It is quite lucrative, and I would say, organizations, or I would say rather, these cyber attackers are organizing themselves within kind of structures that are becoming organizational, and they're wanting to make a quick dollar just by ransoming organizations that have critical data or systems or whatever. What I would say, though, is this number is, I hope it is representative of the number of organizations that have been hit by ransomware attacks, but maybe not have made the headlines, because I think what you're seeing is a lot of organizations making headlines, but I think what Lester, Shak, and I are seeing on a day-to-day are those that maybe don't make the headlines, but are still getting ransomed. So very interesting to see that number for sure.
Yeah, and I think 85 seems a bit high, in my opinion, right? Depending on what the number of surveyed people are. But I think there are a lot of people that are not reporting it, or even like what Kailee said, if it's reported, it doesn't make the headlines, it goes under the radar. Doesn't mean that they're not being impacted, and the damage done is still being faced by, unfortunately, a lot of small, medium businesses that in the most unfortunate cases, their business closes down. So yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, and it's starting to impact society as a whole.
Yeah, so the ransomware is not always the big headline taking activity. It's not always the being ransomed for millions and millions. It could be small amounts. But one interesting thing that somebody commented in there was, if the trend continues, more companies will be ransomed than turn a profit. I mean, it feels like it's almost just become part of doing business, is the fact that you've got to take into account being ransomware attacked.
Unfortunately, yeah. And do you, right? Does it really need to go down that far, right? Because that is doom and gloom. But just to go back to the previous question, what's interesting and the reason why we see them being so successful is the whole business model, right? So we talk about ransomware as a service. A lot of these people on the ground that are doing the sort of exfiltration or I guess deploying the ransomware, they have a playbook. They have a run book, right? And it's like, Google your target, right? See how much revenue you're making before you decide if you're going to target.
100%.
So it's really interesting to see those playbooks. It works, right? They have playbooks. They know exactly what to do. But we can get a bit more into there. There's a lot of interesting things when we start to look at it from that side.
And Shaq, that's super interesting. On top of that, actually, I read a comment this morning on LinkedIn. I was scrolling and somebody had mentioned that, these criminals are even, if they're able to access your systems and data, and they're able to get their hands on your insurance policy, sometimes they'll ransom the demand that is exactly your ransomware within your cyber insurance policy. So somebody had mentioned in this commentary to even put a decoy insurance policy with a lower amount, which I thought was very interesting.
I like
but
that.
yeah, me too.
Honeypot,
almost a honeypot, exactly.
A honey token, yes. So I think deception technologies are underrated. They can because if you think about a chessboard, right, and you think the attacker only has to succeed once, now the attacker might think they've succeeded. But you've kind of turned the tables on them, right? They're now trying to guess, like, have I got something real or not?
What? That's
absolutely.
That's the first piece of like something I can do tomorrow morning.
Absolutely.
Things that we can do. Put it in a very prominent place. Put it somewhere where they're likely to find it.
And also don't put your real one on. Yeah, exactly.
Don't make it too obvious either, right? It's like,
that's right. Make sure your Photoshop skills are up to date.
And I think it's interesting because, again, if we look at like the Cobalt Strike and we look at some of the playbooks and the leaked stuff that came out of some of the ransomware gangs, it was all about Google your target, see how much they earn, if they're worth like targeting. And then look for documents, exactly what you said, Kailee. Look for interesting documents. Insurance documents are always going to be interesting, right? To see if they're covered, right? And how much can we, when it comes to negotiation, how much can we get out of them based on the level of coverage that they have from an insurance perspective? So they're getting really sophisticated. They know what kind of data they're looking for. And then what becomes really interesting is, at the negotiation stage, right? Challenge the attackers. Have you actually got some real data? Have you got something interesting, right? That is worth our time, right? And obviously that we can get into the whole paying or not paying debate as well.
Absolutely.
There's a great question in here. So Alan Jenkins, hey Alan, thanks for your question. He's made an initial bid for the mug. Is there substance to the suggestion that the number of ransomware incidents has peaked, or has it become yesterday's news through overexposure in the news?
That's a great question. I would probably say no. I think what we're seeing in the news is just the tip of the iceberg, and a lot of organizations, as mentioned by the team here, aren't necessarily reporting. We're seeing now more and more the need to report, and that's being forced by governments on the need to report ransomware attacks. But what we're seeing in the news, I would say, is just the tip of the iceberg on ransomware attacks. And on top of that, data exfiltration attacks that are subsequent. Sorry, Lester, you have a lot of background.
Was that?
Lester's being ransomed right now. Yeah,
someone's under another kind of attack.
Yeah, no kidding. Holy.
That's DDoSing the entire session. Sorry.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Can you tell them it's not about DDoSing, it's about ransomware attack?
Yeah.
I'll give them a call later on.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
Yep.
I think what Kailee mentions, I think that has been a little bit of a desensitization to ransomware. It's no longer the hottest topic on the news, and therefore people get the sense that it's not that critical or not that common anymore. But I think it's a misnomer. It's still ongoing. The preparation and readiness to respond to such an attack still has to be put into rigor into your overall cybersecurity program, because it's still a difficult question to answer, and people are still going to be asking those difficult questions. So companies still need to continue to build on that front.
I would
We
tend
have,
to agree, Lester. There's definitely a desensitization because of how much it's been in the news.
Yeah.
But it doesn't make the threat any less real.
So we have a poll lined up, which it's going to be an entirely unscientific straw poll, nonetheless. But given we're a collection of InfoSec folks, the question is: have you been involved in a ransomware response? Yes, no. So if we could run that poll, let's just see whether it's, if everybody on here has, and it's going to reflect these figures. It'd be interesting. So let's run that for a few minutes. Shak, you were about to say something, I believe.
I think it's from the news. We see some of the high-profile cases, right, and those are the ones that get a lot of traction. People, I guess, that are, there's a certain type of organization and people behind that haven't seen an attack necessarily, or kind of the scale of things that could go really bad. And you're kind of blind to what happens when it actually happens, right? Because it's like panic stations. And I guess, this is a really good question, right? Have you been involved in an incident? And it's interesting to see people's stories. But from an incident response perspective, I was involved in support for an EDR solution. So we'd get calls every day with people that were under attack. And it's really about sort of walking them through a plan, right? What do we need to do to get to something good?
Yeah,
absolutely.
But it does cause panic, right? It causes chaos, and it can large organizations have been totally decimated, right? And they've had to rethink their whole cybersecurity strategy, which has been neglected, by the way, over years and years through legacy systems. There is an element of we see this head in the sand. It's not happened to us, so we're fine. We don't see an attack, right? We're good.
And on top of that, Shak, what I find is going back to your comment about sorry, I think there was another question or comment in the chat, but when you're in a state of panic and when you're responding to a crisis, if you have a plan, sometimes what we find is that you're not necessarily following that plan. So what best case would be is to exercise that plan often, so that you gain muscle memory around it, as opposed to picking it up when you're in the middle of a cybersecurity crisis and then having to sort through and understand that plan in the middle of responding to that crisis. So absolutely, I think having a plan is great, but exercising it at least once a year and having all the folks that would be responsible for having a position when responding to a ransomware attack is where we would like to go.
So we're definitely moving. We're definitely segueing onto the panel proper. But there's a couple of comments in the chat that I want to raise here, which I think just goes to show how muddy the water is. So Kevin, thank you for your comment in there. Statistics from firms like Aon, the insurer, and RSM show that ransomware declined last year, but has risen again in the last 3 months. And a comment from Alison Norwood: Black Fog report that ransomware is underreported by over 1,000%. It's one of those things, you don't know what you don't know, right? It's very it's difficult to really ascertain the scale and severity of the problem. You only hear about the really bad stuff. It looks like it's dreadful. If you don't hear much at all, it looks like it's no problem at all, but people just aren't talking about it. So just before we move on to the panel proper, let's take a look at that poll that we ran. We've got the results in. It's that's very interesting. It's kind of indicative of the other way round, of only 40% saying that they have been involved in a ransomware response. It may be down to how we've worded it. I don't know, but yeah, that's quite interesting. It does go to show that this is a complex topic, and it's stats alone can we can talk to our stats to say anything we want, I guess.
Mhm.
But it's an interesting point.
I-
So
I do have something to add to that. So Kailee just mentioned about sort of exercising a plan, and I think that's so valuable, and people kind of underestimate the power of that, because it's also about reaching a level of maturity, right, from a cybersecurity program perspective. And you don't know what you don't know, right, until you test it. And a lot of organizations, unfortunately, kind of again ignore the problems that they have, right, and saying, well, if we were to have a ransomware attack, what could it look like? And it is, something that I get involved in day-to-day basis. But JJ mentioned, right, sleeping in the server room, right, trying to recover the backup tapes. And that's critical. That's important, right? At least there were backup tapes in that case, right? They were offline backup. I think going back to the whole issue about ransomware targeting, things like your backup. Again, it's an area that you could test, right? And what better way to test that when you're not actually under attack, right? And you can actually refine and fine tune your
make
gaps,
mistakes.
right?
Absolutely.
And train your team, right, on how to respond from an incident
And not
response
only,
perspective.
absolutely, and not only the ability to recover from backups, but the sequencing of backups and restoration, um, absolutely vital, because you don't ever want to be put into a position where you're forced to pay ransom demand. You always want to be able to have, the ability to restore. And I think that does go back to the article that we were talking about just earlier. I think attackers more and more are going after backups. So how do you keep your backups safe from the attackers to not have the ransomware propagate to them, so that you can continue to have the ability to restore? Absolutely something to consider when you're practicing your response, and then of course practicing the restoration of your backups.
Oh,
Yeah.
interestingly, so I think Veeam was the vendor, but it doesn't matter, right? They all have their own issues as well. They have their own vulnerabilities, and in fact, the bigger the vendor, the bigger the target on their head, from a threat perspective, and the more possibility of vulnerabilities that can be exploited as well. So
Yep.
we see that quite a bit as well.
Yep, absolutely.
So we've got a lot of questions lined up. My goodness, it's going to be mostly the audience talking today. So the first one was from JJ Davey. It's probably more of a comment than anything, but effectively, it's a formidable challenge. No apparent signs of diminishing. Many businesses and victims, it would seem, failed to prioritize the essential principles of technical security and procedural measures. As an industry, we might need to approach this from a different angle. What do you think? I hold certain perspectives, but I'm generally eager to hear what you think. Is there a different angle we can take? I mean, surely it's just carrying out basic technical security and procedural hygiene, right?
Yeah.
There's no panacea, no clever way of inverting the solution, right?
Yeah, it reminds me of the $10 wrench attack, right? You could have the most
Yes.
sophisticated cryptography, security, whatever, right? And the attacker is not that sophisticated, right? They're looking for the easy win. If I can hit
Yeah.
somebody over the head with a wrench, great,
Until
right?
they give you the password.
The analogy is, grab something that's low hanging, easy, right? And you're in. And a lot of attackers tend to target things like credentials. If phishing a user, for example, and harvesting credentials, right? I'm into the network. I don't need to do anything sophisticated. So the cyber hygiene aspect is, I think it's a really good point, right? The basics, time and time again, what we see is the basics. People are just failing on the real basics.
Do we overemphasize the technical aspects of this? Is it literally, if I buy a solution, I'm going to be secure, rather than, as you say, let's get the basics, but let's make sure, attacking computers is hard, attacking humans is easy. It's not just technology, it's actually education, awareness, training.
Look,
It's
I
making
think
sure
that
people
it's
aware.
the whole gambit, and I think industry as a whole, industry response and private-public collaboration is also vital to quicker response, because if you think you're isolated and you just keep it to yourself, then there's no speeds of the cycle of a flow of information to be able to help support the next guy who's going to get hit. And I think, like what JJ said, is there a different approach? I think if you look at what FBI has been doing, they're trying to persecute the threat actors, and I think it's going to take the whole ecosystem to work together. Like you mentioned, there's no one solution. There are plenty of gaps, but it's a probability game. You got to fill as many gaps as possible, shrink the vulnerabilities to as small as possible.
It takes a long time.
And I think the most important is if everyone agrees that if it's a when, not if, then why are we not talking about when that happens? What does everyone supposed to do? And if you take that mindset change and know that you are stepping into a boxing ring, you are going to get a punch, then let's talk about getting punched and let's carry on from there.
I would tend to agree. And I think there, as Lester mentioned, there's no kind of red pill for making sure that you're going to be, come out of it on top or have the most secure system. I think it goes hand in hand, right? You have to have the technology to support being, not only be able to proactively respond or proactively reduce your risk exposure, but also put in controls and technology to help your resilience. I think if we look at the classic risk equals impact times probability matrix, right? We know that the probability is there that you might be ransomed. So the only thing that you can do is diminish the impact. And the way, in my opinion, that you would be able to do that is by implementing controls in not only processes, but of course technology and processes that support that technology, and then practicing them yet again. And I love the comment that we have here in the chat by Alan around having offline backups, Commvault. Absolutely. Our team was just in the middle of responding to a cyber attack not too long ago, and the client had off-site tapes that were backed up, that were clean, and let me tell you, it was the saving grace for this client. So absolutely having offline backups is the way to go.
Going back to the point on, I guess, basic sort of cyber hygiene, sometimes it's a configuration issue. And a lot of the times, people haven't necessarily configured their controls properly, and we see that as well, or deployed their controls properly. So I was involved in emulating some of these attacks, like a ransomware attack, and we found a bunch of servers where they had a really good EDR solution, but somebody forgot to deploy it to the servers, right, to critical infrastructure. It was as simple as that. Right? How do you audit that? How do you check that? And I think going back to sort of getting...
Well, you asked the question, have you rolled it out to the servers?
Yeah, exactly, right? Really, really simple. But for the business point, it's the ability to be competitive, right? And the reputational costs. And we've seen some of the more sort of larger incidents where it's taken their business away, right, to their competitors. They've been able to then use that as an opportunity to say, look, we do something better. We're taking care of your data, and customers care about these things.
I'm going to pick up on the comment you made, Lester. We all agree that it's a case of when, not if. And there's a question in here that talks about that. It's from Raphael, and I guess this is the difference between reactive or proactive. But what are some effective tactics for establishing trust and rapport with hackers during the negotiations, or do you not even think about that? So does your runbook even include these kinds of things? Do you even start negotiations?
I would start off by saying, if you are not a negotiator yourself, do not start negotiations with a threat actor. You're going to want to inform your external legal counsel that is that has experience, kind of managing cyber attacks, and they will bring on a third party that will help to start those negotiations with a threat actor. You can also have, a firm on retainer that that can help you with negotiations, but I would caveat that by saying do not start negotiations with the threat actor themselves. Please leave it to the experts on that one for sure. Building rapport, again, leave it to the experts.
Yeah.
I don't know how Shaq and Lester you feel about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and there's people that, like Kailee, you probably worked with people that are trained in that particular area, right, and know exactly what to say, and try and understand, right. First of all, I think it's about establishing what have they actually got, right. What is the cost of recovering that data? There's an element of that, right, as well, that you need to think about. But I think having a third party,
I think is called proof of life, right? You want to request the proof of life of your
Yeah.
data from the threat actors.
Yeah.
It really is like a ransom negotiation, almost as if a life was at hand,
Yeah.
Send me the left pinky of my database.
We want the date and timestamp on a newspaper.
Holding a copy of today's newspaper. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, and absolutely, I totally agree. I think you have a third party that has, a cool head, right, and can approach it in a different way, whereas you kind of need to still run your business, right, and think of the day-to-day stuff.
And no emotional connection either.
Yeah.
There's a business
100%.
connection, and that's important. But let's be honest here, that your business is run by people who have very strong emotional investment in the company and what's going on, and will potentially make mistakes as a result of that. So putting it to that third party is going to disconnect those negotiations somewhat in a good way.
Yeah. And the threat actors will they will stop at nothing. They will absolutely play on your heartstrings down to, threatening or, threatening family members we've seen. It's been quite intense. So I think Thom kind of hit the nail on the head there when we're talking about that emotional human element. You want to be as far removed from that as possible and throw in the experts to be able to negotiate on your behalf.
Yeah.
And you're going to want to figure all this out in a peaceful exercise, not during a crisis.
Yeah.
Because,
Exactly.
I mean, like, it's a difficult question, and even the human tendency is to want to react quickly, right? Because you have timelines, deadlines, ticking bomb on your screen. But so I think really gotta step back and look at all your playbooks. Your playbooks may not even talk about details like that, right? This where during exercises, this difficult questions, decisions, who's making the call, who has authority to sign off on getting the retainer pushed through. All these questions are going to take up a lot of time during a real incident, and there's no time. Time is so precious during the response. So do it peacetime, exercise the hell out of it, so that, touch wood, when it happens, hopefully the processes kick in, but if not, at least you have swept through it before, and then you can have a bit of a clearer mind and not clouded by whatever emotions and stress and all the various decisions that you would have to make in a real incident.
I've seen incident response teams and cybersecurity teams when they're going through these kind of drilling exercises, it also makes them more comfortable with their landscape, right? The kind of things that they should be looking for, right? And being better at it, right? And doing that sort of iteratively, it becomes a feedback loop. It's so powerful and very underestimated and very easy to do as well.
So we have a question from Mario Rossi. Thank you, Mario. Which is kind of like the next sort of logical step on, which is, in terms of your experience, would you say that organizations are properly prepared to respond to ransomware incidents? And if not, how often do you see organizations pay attackers to decrypt their data, e.g. in case they did not have proper backups? So this then comes down to the question to pay or not to pay.
Yeah.
Maybe we could ask that poll, Thom.
Yes, indeed. It's almost like we thought about this earlier. We have a poll on just this. While we discuss it for the next few minutes, if we get the poll run, you can ask. We'll ask you: should you pay ransomware? Yes, no, or the standard consultant's answer: it depends. But yeah. So when it comes to it, how often do we see people paying ransoms?
I think the number that we saw in the article that we were just discussing a moment earlier was around 80%. Of course, that's of the organizations that we know have paid, and that have reported that have paid. But it doesn't, in my opinion, that number doesn't take into consideration all the organizations that haven't, been public about payment. I would assume that number is around the same, maybe 80%, maybe a bit higher, but it all comes down to how ready you are to respond. And if we go back to that question, have we seen organizations, do we feel that the ones that we've, helped to get ready for a ransomware attack, do we feel that they're ready? I would say the general consensus is, Tom, you're going to hate me, but it depends, is the consultant answer.
Oh, we know where you work.
Yeah, but it does.
Yes. Yeah.
Every organization is different. We've seen organizations that have, practiced for the first time this year how to respond to a ransomware demand, and those that are much more sophisticated and a little bit more mature that have practiced or do practice responding to cyber attacks on a yearly basis, if not twice a year. So again, it really depends on the organization and how far along you are in your cybersecurity strategy and roadmap.
It's something that I think is changing in the industry, though. I think if we asked this question 5 years ago, it would be an
100%.
emphatic no. We don't negotiate with terrorists, blah, 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 blah. No, we absolutely don't. That's not a real reflection on actually, we've got to keep this business alive and breathing and earning money.
Yeah. And also, right, it's the cost of replacing that data, but worse, and I think what probably has the attacker's advantage here is the double extortion, right, and sometimes triple extortion, right? You've got data now that's going to be published somewhere, data that you don't want to be published, right? And there could be company secrets, the customer data, all of that.
Hey, Shaq, can I ask you to explain double extortion and triple extortion for maybe the folks who don't understand that in the chat?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we're talking about
extra crew.
Yeah.
We're essentially talking about the data being encrypted, and obviously you've lost that data, but then it's potentially being published somewhere into the public domain, but then it's also your customers' data is also being. So when we talk about triple extortion, now it's data that you have about other people is also there, and so that affects your clientele, your customer base.
And healthcare is one that's at high risk of that because of the embarrassing conditions that people have. They don't want their medical history published, etc.
Yeah. And on top of that, what we've seen threat actors do is even go out to your customers or suppliers or whomever data you hold and say, hey, we've got X organization under cyber attack and we have your data. They're not paying us.
Yes.
Do something about it. And that that just is on that topic of triple ransom. But it is the risk. Yeah, absolutely.
Let's take a look at the poll. I was going to say not surprising, but it's certainly not the panel consensus here. I think we've obviously got a lot of old school hardliners out there. We absolutely don't negotiate, whatever happens. Just 10% say yes. Well, maybe they're the ones who know that they haven't got a plan in place. I don't know, and it depends, which I think is the nuanced answer of, well, we'd rather not, but sometimes business needs, right? But that's quite an interesting one, given that we're sort of primarily an InfoSec, viewership here, or not of InfoSec audience. That it's an emphatic no, really. I wonder if it was asked at with sort of chief finance officers or CEOs, what the answer would be in that instance. I think that would make quite interesting reading there.
Yeah, and I think that ties back to cybersecurity is just one part of the business, right? Understanding all the priorities of the different lines, whether it's technology, risk, finance, everyone has their own considerations, rightfully so. And that's going to be challenging to come to that decision, right? And I think part of being prepared is knowing what's important to the different parts of the business, I mean, at the end of the day, a few names got to make a call, right? That's why they are paid to make certain decisions. And I think as InfoSec practitioners, we need to give the best advice in terms of protecting our data, protecting the business. But sometimes business priorities come into play. And we just got to be aware and give the best advice that we can.
I think that's just it.
Yeah.
Let's move
And
on
on top of that.
Oh, sorry, go on.
Sorry. I would add, Lester, though, on top of that, whenever you're making the decision to pay or not pay, lean on your external legal counsel and breach coach to help you get all the right information to help make that decision. You never want to be going into that decision blind. There's quite an analysis that's done from a risk and impact perspective when making that decision, including possible fines and legal implications,
sanctions and all. Yeah.
Exactly. So if I can leave just a tidbit of information for those that have that risk in their organizations, lean on your external legal counsel to help and / breach coach to help provide the right level of information to make that decision.
I'm going to pick you up on breach coach. That's not a phrase I've heard before. I mean, it makes sense, but could you just elaborate a bit on your breach coach?
Sure, Tom. Yeah. So in the realm of cyber attacks, there are a couple of we call them breach coaches. There's one that is typically on the incident response side, so that's going to help manage the technical response to a cyber attack. And then there's one on the more informative strategic side, which is typically your external legal counsel that would occupy the seat as breach coach. And they're usually within the crisis management team and helping them navigate all the strategic decisions that come into play when being in the face of a ransomware or any type of cyber attack.
Interesting. Very good. I'm going to move on to another question. I can tell you now we've got more questions than we've got time to answer, I'm afraid, but that's a really good sign. So thank you all for your questions so far. But John Acornley, thank you, John. If 85% of organizations have had a ransomware attack in the last 12 months, can we assume that most of these attacked organizations now have strong security so they are not successfully attacked again? I'm going to jump straight in there with a blog post from the NCSC, the National Cybersecurity Council of the UK, from a couple of years ago, I think, where they talked about a company that was ransomed. They didn't have any backups, so they paid. And then literally 2 weeks later, after getting all their data back, were hit with the exact same ransom, the same gang, because they didn't do anything about the actual vulnerability in the first place. And it cost them something like £6.5 million both times?
Sure it was, yep.
So that may be an edge case, but it's not always true, right?
Yeah, I would say there's two pieces here, and Shaq, Lester, sorry for jumping in right away, but there's two things to consider here. So number one, you're absolutely right, Tom. If you give the precedence that you're willing to pay for, further ransom, they will be back if you haven't patched your systems, if you don't have the ability to restore, and then you're put in that same circumstance. On the bright side, though, what we see typically in organizations is if ransomware wasn't a risk before, now, once you've been ransomed, it becomes a risk that's reported all the way up to the board, and it actually becomes institutionalized and managed, on a cadence. And so it actually becomes important for the organizations to start implementing controls and throwing money at it to be able to beef up our cybersecurity posture to make sure it doesn't happen again. So that's the bright side of it, I guess you could say. But I'm sure Lester Shaq have comments on that as well.
Oh, we see it all the time. Budgets suddenly increase, right? And it's like, we've got more money to now actually fix a problem that we should have fixed before, right? And I think there's a lot to say about preventative measures. And unfortunately, some companies, organizations need that wake-up call. And some never get it right. And that decimates their business if they get hit over and over because they haven't done anything about it. But, the ones that unfortunately learn from that process now suddenly have, a bigger budget, some money to spend, and they can do cyber properly. But it's like you said, Kailee, I totally agree. It's not just about technology. It's not just about controls. It's about people. It's about culture. It's about processes. All of those things matter, right? And you've got to get buy-in from the top. We always talk about, right, having that sort of management buy-in. Unfortunately, I think perhaps a lot of CEOs, a lot of organizations, leaders of business, right, are probably taking it more seriously now, but didn't in the past, and understand that a cyber attack can be you can be a real buzzkill, right? It can be a bad day. It can be
Loving
a really
that term.
bad day, right? But it can
Absolutely.
it can close, it can shut your business down. So I think a lot more people are savvy to that and need to. I always advocate, right, that I think more budget is always good, but we do speak to a lot of organizations that are struggling to get budget, right, to fix the real basics, and it's really sad that that's there, and it's easy pickings for the bad guys.
And I think there's also a danger of becoming like learned helplessness, right? You don't want to fall in that state that there's nothing that we can do, even you spend so much money, you still get hit. I think there has to be a way to communicate the value of whatever the cybersecurity program brings to the organization. It's not just throwing money into an endless pit and it never seems to end. Yeah. It's an ongoing battle, and it's the cost of doing business, unfortunately. And I think we just got to understand the reality of what the environment is like that we operate in, and continue to advocate the importance of it. Yeah, because once we allow the board and decision makers to allow into the sense of helplessness, then you'll never get your money.
This is where stress testing your security, doing the tabletop exercise, you understand what's working, right? Are you spending money on the right things? Are you doing the right things? And so it goes back to that whole concept, right? Test your playbook, see where the gaps are, and keep improving from there.
Absolutely. I think that's an excellent place to draw to a close. We're coming rapidly up on time. We've got a load of questions left here. Questions from Adam, Simon, Duncan, Kathy. We've had comments on LinkedIn. No questions though, so no mugs, I'm afraid, for LinkedIn. We've had comments from LinkedIn, even from an old host of the show as well, which is nice to see. And plenty of chat. So there is so much more to talk about on this, but we are coming up against time. So I'm going to go around the group. I'm going to ask you all to give that one piece of advice. What's the one thing people can do when they get to their desks or back to their desks tomorrow morning when it comes to ransomware in inverted commas? It can be the simplest thing ever. I'm going to give you 20 seconds. I'm feeling really generous today. So, Lester, why don't you go first? In 20 seconds, what's the one thing people should be taking away from this and doing tomorrow morning?
Yeah. So find 6 colleagues, 3 in cyber, 3 non-cyber. Ask them what they're going to do if a ransom note pops up on their corporate device. If the 3 cyber colleagues answer different questions, then look at your playbooks and your exercises. If the 3 non-cyber colleagues give you different answers, then look at your awareness and training. So that's something simple that you can do. Don't get shocked by the results, and then you'll figure out what to do.
I like that one. Kailee.
Thanks, Thom. I have to leave you with 3. I'm sorry. But first and foremost, double check that you have a plan and practice it frequently, at least once a year, against different types of cyber attacks. Number 2, understand your ability to restore systems, because you never want to be put into a position where you're forced to pay ransom. So go ahead, go back to your teams and double check that you're testing those DR plans. You have DR plans. You have the ability to restore. And I think the last one for me is ask yourself, if you were ever faced or your organization was ever faced with a ransomware demand, do you feel that you and your team would have the right capacity to respond? And if the answer is, I'm not sure, or no, ask yourself why, and then dig a little bit deeper into that. And then I think you'll come up with some answers and some great nuggets of information to better yourself.
Okay, and Shaq.
Perfect. I think you guys have nailed it right in terms of what we do and what I talk about, and we call it validate your cybersecurity. And so the playbooks, that sort of regular testing becomes so important. But you can do it more often than twice a year. right? And a lot of organizations do that with running Pentera. But I think the testing is so underestimated and just should be something that people need to look at more.
Very good. So thank you to my panelists, Kailee, Lester, and Shak. And Shak, I forgot to mention, you are today's sponsor. So thank you very much for that. Those of you who are joining, enjoying your tea and coffee and biscuits at home, you can thank Shak for that as our sponsor. So let's move on to, the most important part, winner of the Teiss mug. I'm going to do 2 today because I'm feeling really generous. And there were so many questions, which unfortunately didn't all get to. So Mario Rossi and Raphael, and I can't read my own writing, Navak, you will be asked for your details to get a Teiss mug. So congratulations, folks. I also, it's in my script, I have to say it, got to remind you of the Teiss R3, Resilience, Response and Recovery. Maybe it should be R4, and have put ransomware in there as well. We've got the conference on the 26th of September. It's just a few months away in London, so check out online from that. There'll be a link in the notes here. I think that's all we've got time for. Actually, I don't think there's anything else I need to. Oh no, next week's session. That's right, leveraging AI to monitor, analyze, and respond to threats. That's next Thursday on the 8th. We're not going to finish this season without talking about AI, right? It's going to hit us at some point. So with that, once again, thank you to our panelists, Kailee, Lester, and Shak. Thank you to the audience. Thank you all for your contributions today. Very, very lively, not only on the chat, but also in the QA and our first comments from LinkedIn. This is brilliant. So with that, I'm going to say thank you very much. Look after yourselves. See you next week and stay secure, my friends.